In the heart of Chicago's underworld, power isn't announced with a gunshot. It's measured by the silence that falls when a man walks into a room. At the Blackwood Grill, a high-end steakhouse catering to the city's elite, Table 9 was a dead zone. The staff called it the graveyard. It was permanently reserved for the Costello family. If they sat down, you stayed away, prayed they didn't look your way, and never got their order wrong. But fear is a luxury the desperate cannot afford. Drowning in a dangerous debt she didn't create, Clara Jenkins realized the man terrifying the entire city was the only one tipping in $100 bills. The Blackwood Grill was a fortress of mahogany, low lighting, and the scent of aged leather and seared prime rib. It was the kind of establishment where city aldermen rubbed elbows with corporate raiders, and the tips could pay a month's rent in a single weekend. Clara had been working there for 6 months. She wasn't there to build a career in hospitality. She was there because her younger brother, Leo, had a gambling addiction that had finally caught up with him in the worst possible way. Leo had racked up $40,000 in debt playing underground poker, and his creditors weren't the type to send polite collection letters. They were the type to send Jimmy the Pipe O'Donnell. Jimmy had given her until the end of the month to come up with the first $10,000, or Leo was going to lose the ability to walk. It was a Tuesday night, typically a slow evening, and she was counting her meager tips in the back station. The knot of anxiety in her stomach pulled so tight she could barely breathe. She had precisely $400. She needed 10 grand by Friday. At 8:30 p.m., the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted. It wasn't a loud disruption. It was the exact opposite. The low hum of wealthy patrons discussing stock options and golf handicaps simply evaporated. The clinking of crystal glasses stopped. Clara looked through the porthole of the kitchen door. Standing at the entrance was Damien Costello. He was 32, inheriting the Costello syndicate after his uncle met a sudden, explosive end in his Cadillac 2 years prior. Damien didn't look like the mobsters from the movies. He wasn't wearing a flashy fedora or a pinstripe suit. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than her car. He was tall, with sharp, unforgiving features, dark hair swept back, and eyes as cold and flat as slate. Flanking him were 2 men who looked like they were carved out of granite. One she would later learn was named Arthur, the other Silas. Richard Hayes, the usually arrogant floor manager, went paler than the linen napkins. He practically stumbled over his own feet as he rushed to greet them, bowing slightly, his voice trembling as he escorted Damien to Table 9. The graveyard. Tucked in the darkest corner of the restaurant, it offered a full view of the room and the exits, while keeping its occupants cloaked in shadows. In the wait station, absolute panic set in. "I'm not going over there," whispered Sarah Miller, a veteran waitress who usually fought tooth and nail for the high-rolling tables. Her hands were physically shaking as she clutched her tray. Last time he was here, a busboy dropped a fork near his shoe, and Arthur grabbed him by the throat. "I'm not doing it, Richard." Richard pushed through the swinging doors, sweat beading on his forehead. "Someone has to take the table. Now. They've been sitting for 2 minutes." "Make one of the new guys do it," a waiter named Thomas hissed, backing away from the door. "They'll stutter, they'll mess it up, and Costello will have this place shut down or burned to the ground," Richard snapped, wiping his brow with a cocktail napkin. "Who is on Section 3 tonight?" Section 3 was Clara's. Everyone turned to look at her. The silence in the wait station mirrored the silence in the dining room. She looked at the terrified faces of her co-workers. Then she looked down at the 4 crumpled $100 bills in her apron pocket. Jimmy O'Donnell's raspy voice echoed in her head. "Friday, Clara. Or Leo drinks his meals through a straw. Desperation overrides common sense. It's a biological imperative. If she stayed in the safety of the kitchen, Leo was as good as dead. If she walked out there, she was stepping into the den of the most dangerous predator in Chicago. But predators had money. "I'll take it," Clara said. Her voice was surprisingly steady, though her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Richard stared at her, blinking rapidly. "Clara, you've only been here 6 months. If you mess this up—" "I know the menu backward and forward, Richard, and I don't shake," she said, grabbing a fresh notepad and a pen. She smoothed down her black apron, took a deep breath that tasted like panic and adrenaline, and pushed through the swinging doors. The walk across the dining room felt like a mile to Clara. She could feel the eyes of the other patrons on her, a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. The closer she got to table 9, the heavier the air felt. Damien's 2 guards were scanning the room with terrifying precision. As she approached, Arthur, the larger of the 2, shifted his weight, his hand resting subtly inside his suit jacket. She didn't slow down. She walked straight to the edge of the table, squared her shoulders and looked directly at the man who held Chicago's underworld in his palm. "Good evening, gentlemen," Clara said, her voice clear and projecting just enough to cut through the quiet. "Welcome to the Blackwood Grill. Can I start you off with a drink, or are we going straight for the reserve bottles tonight?" Arthur and Silas stared at her as if she had just pulled the pin on a grenade. Nobody spoke to Damien Costello with that kind of casual confidence. They were used to trembling voices, downcast eyes, and absolute subservience. Damien didn't look up immediately. He was studying the rim of his empty water glass. For a terrifying 3 seconds, Clara thought she had made a fatal miscalculation. Then, slowly, he raised his head. His eyes met hers. Up close, the slate grey of his irises was striking, devoid of warmth, but burning with a sharp, calculating intelligence. He didn't look at her the way men usually look at waitresses. He looked at her the way a chess grandmaster looks at a piece that has suddenly moved itself across the board. "You're new," Damien said. His voice was a low baritone, quiet enough that you had to lean in slightly to hear it, which forced everyone around him to constantly be at his mercy. "I've been here 6 months, Mr. Costello. Section 3 just isn't usually my rotation," Clara replied smoothly, holding his gaze. A tiny, almost imperceptible shift happened in his expression. "You know who I am. Everyone in Chicago knows who you are," Clara stated, keeping her tone strictly professional, neither deferential nor insolent. Just factual. "Which is why I know you probably want the McAllen 25 year to start. Neat. Unless it's been a particularly long Tuesday, in which case I'd recommend the Pappy Van Winkle 23. We keep a bottle-off menu for special clientele." Silas let out a low scoff. "Bold." Damien held up a single finger, and Silas instantly fell silent. Damien leaned back in the heavy leather booth, lacing his fingers together. "The Pappy, 3 glasses. And bring the bottle." "Right away," she said. "And for dinner?" "The kitchen just prepped a dry-aged tomahawk ribeye. I can have the chef prepare it rare, Pittsburgh style, charred on the outside, blood red in the center. I imagine you appreciate things that don't spend too much time in the fire." Clara held her breath the moment the words left her mouth. It was a risk, a massive one. It bordered on familiarity, a veiled reference to his brutal reputation. Damien stared at her. The silence stretched. Arthur's hand tightened on the table edge. Her pulse was roaring in her ears. She kept her face utterly blank, projecting a calm she absolutely didn't feel. Then, the unthinkable happened. Damien Costello smiled. It was a small, dangerous smile, a slight curving of his lips that didn't quite reach his eyes, but it shifted the entire dynamic of the room. 3 tomahawks, Damien ordered softly. Pittsburgh style. And what is your name? Clara, she said. Bring the bourbon, Clara. She nodded once, pivoted on her heel, and walked back toward the bar. As soon as she pushed through the kitchen doors, her knees buckled. She had to grab the edge of the stainless steel prep counter to stop herself from hitting the floor. Richard practically tackled her. What happened? Are you fired? Are we dead? He babbled. They ordered 3 tomahawks and the off-menu pappy, she gasped, forcing herself to stand upright. Get the bottle, Richard. Now. The rest of the service was a masterclass in tightrope walking. She served their drinks with precision, keeping her movements deliberate and visible so the guards didn't get jumpy. When a busboy dropped a tray of glasses on the opposite side of the restaurant, the sound echoed like a gunshot. Arthur and Silas were out of their seats in a fraction of a second. She happened to be pouring water for Damien at that exact moment. She didn't flinch. She didn't spill a drop. She just kept pouring. Damien noticed. He watched the water fill his glass, then looked up at her. You don't startle easily, Clara. I have a younger brother, Clara replied evenly. I'm used to loud noises and breaking glass. Brothers can be liabilities, Damien observed, his tone conversational, but his eyes searching her face for a reaction. Only if you let them be, she answered, stepping back. Enjoy your steaks, gentlemen. For the next hour, Clara anticipated their needs before they had to ask. Extra napkins, a fresh bucket of ice, a subtle nod to the chef to fire the sides. She treated Damien Costello not as a monster, but as a VIP. By the end of the meal, the tension at table 9 had completely dissolved. When it was time for the check, the total was astronomical, nearly $3,000. She placed the leather folio on the table. Damien didn't even look at the itemized receipt. He pulled a thick money clip from his jacket and began peeling off $100 bills. He laid down 30 bills to cover the check. Then he looked at her, paused, and laid down 20 more. $2,000, a tip of nearly 70%. For your excellent service, Clara, Damien said, sliding the folio to the edge of the table. Thank you, Mr. Costello, Clara said, her hand trembling slightly as she picked up the leather book. I prefer Damien, he said softly, rising from the booth. His men instantly flanked him. I'll be seeing you again, Clara. Clara watched him walk out, the dining room holding its collective breath until the heavy glass doors swung shut behind him. In the wait station, she counted the crisp $100 bills. $2,000. It wasn't the 10 grand she needed for Jimmy O'Donnell, but it was enough to keep Leo's legs unbroken for another week. Little did she know, the money she had just accepted was the bait in a trap she couldn't possibly comprehend. The air inside the Rusty Anchor, an Irish dive bar on the south side, smelled of stale beer, bleach, and desperation. It was a stark contrast to the mahogany and leather of the Blackwood Grill. Clara walked in at 2 a.m., still in her work clothes, clutching an envelope containing $2,500, the $2 grand from Damien Costello, plus her previous tips. Jimmy the Pipe O'Donnell was sitting in the back booth, counting a thick stack of 20s. He was a brute of a man, with a face that looked like it had been run over by a truck and a reputation for using lead pipes on kneecaps, hence the nickname. She slid into the booth opposite him and tossed the envelope onto the sticky table. $2,500, that buys Leo an extension. Jimmy didn't touch the envelope immediately. He took a slow drag from a cheap cigar, eyeing her through the smoke. He reached out, his thick fingers tearing open the paper, and thumbed through the crisp new $100 bills. He paused, rubbing the texture of the bills together. "Fresh print," Jimmy grunted. "Where's a steakhouse waitress getting uncirculated hundreds, Clara? You start turning tricks for the Gold Coast executives?" "My shifts are none of your business, Jimmy. Count the money. We have a deal." Jimmy chuckled, a wet, rattling sound. "We had a deal for 10 grand by Friday. This is 2,500. That covers the interest, sweetheart. The principal is still 40, and my patience is still running out." Her blood ran cold. "Interest? We didn't agree on interest. You said 10 grand stops the threats." "I lied." Jimmy smiled, revealing yellowed teeth. "Leo knew the terms. You think I'm running a charity? You owe me another 10 by next Friday, or I send the boys to your apartment." Clara wanted to scream. She wanted to reach across the table and claw his eyes out, but she was powerless. She stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the linoleum. "You'll get your money." Clara left the bar feeling like she was suffocating. She had sold her soul at the restaurant, stood toe-to-toe with the Mafia, and it hadn't changed a damn thing. She was still drowning. 2 nights later, the Blackwood Grill was packed. Clara was running ragged, balancing 3 large tables, when the atmosphere in the room shifted again. The silence descended. The graveyard was occupied. She turned around, holding a tray of empty martini glasses. Damien Costello was sitting at table 9. This time he was alone. No Arthur. No Silas. Just Damien, looking immaculate in a navy blue suit, his cold eyes tracking her movements across the floor. Richard materialized beside her, practically shoving her toward the corner. "Go, now." Clara approached the table, trying to mask the bone-deep exhaustion she felt. "Good evening, Mr. Coe. Damien. Table for 1 tonight?" "Just me, Clara," he said, gesturing to the empty seat across from him. "Sit." She froze. "Excuse me?" "Sit down," he repeated, his tone soft but leaving absolutely no room for refusal. "I'm on the clock, Damien. If Richard catches me sitting with a guest, I'll be fired." "Richard works for me," Damien stated casually. "He just doesn't know it yet. Sit." Slowly, her heart pounding, she slid into the booth across from the most feared man in Chicago. Up close, without his guards, the intensity radiating from him was palpable. He didn't look at the menu. He looked at her face. He looked at the dark circles under her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands that she couldn't quite control today. "You look tired, Clara. It's a demanding job." "It's not the job," Damien said, leaning forward slightly. "A woman like you doesn't shake because she's carrying plates. She shakes because she's carrying a burden. 2 days ago, you were made of ice. Today, you look like a woman who is running out of time." Clara swallowed hard, breaking eye contact. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I make it my business to know things," Damien said smoothly. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, sliding it across the table toward her. "For example, I know you visited a rather unsavory establishment on the south side at 2 a.m. on Wednesday, the Rusty Anchor, known hangout for low-level leg breakers." Panic flared hot and bright in her chest. "Are you having me followed?" "I protect my investments," Damien replied calmly. "You provided exceptional service. You showed a rare fortitude. I was intrigued, so I had Arthur make a few inquiries. Your brother, Leo, $40,000 in debt to Jimmy O'Donnell. A nasty piece of work, Jimmy." She felt exposed, stripped bare. The powerful, collected facade she wore at the restaurant was crumbling. "What do you want, Damien?" she whispered, glancing around nervously. "I want to offer you a solution," he said. "I don't need your charity." "It's not charity. It's an acquisition," Damien corrected him, his eyes locking onto hers. "Jimmy O'Donnell is a parasite. But more importantly, he's a parasite who doesn't realize who he's feeding off of. Clara frowned, confused. What does that mean? Damien tapped the folded paper on the table. Slowly, she reached out and unfolded it. It was a photocopy of a ledger. Leo's name was on it, next to the staggering number of $40,000. But what caught her eye wasn't the debt. It was the header at the top of the ledger. It wasn't Jimmy's name. It was the name of the LLC that financed Jimmy's street loans. Costello Holdings. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked up at Damien, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. Jimmy O'Donnell doesn't own your brother's debt, Clara, Damien said softly, a dark, possessive gleam entering his eyes. I do. The revelation hung in the air between them, suffocating and absolute. The paper in her trembling hands felt heavier than a stone slab. Costello Holdings. Damien wasn't just a terrifying customer anymore. He was the architect of her family's nightmare. You own the debt, she whispered, the words scraping against her dry throat. Jimmy works for you. Jimmy is a blunt instrument, Damien corrected smoothly, leaning back into the mahogany booth. He runs street-level collections for a subsidiary of my organization. He is supposed to collect standard, vigorish. But lately, Jimmy has been greedy, charging unauthorized interest, threatening violence without my sanction. Clara stared at him, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He threatened to break my brother's legs. He demanded $10,000 by Friday, and then told me the $2,500 I gave him was just interest. A cold, dangerous shadow crossed Damien's face. It wasn't directed at her, but the sheer temperature drop in his eyes made her shiver. I am aware, which is why Jimmy O'Donnell's tenure with my organization is coming to an abrupt end. He reached across the table, his large, impeccably manicured hand gently covering her trembling fingers to stop them from shaking. The contact sent a jolt of electricity up her arm. His skin was warm, a sharp contrast to his icy demeanor. I don't believe in coincidences, Clara, Damien said softly. You walked up to my table when grown men were cowering in the kitchen. You looked me in the eye. You handled my men, my demands, and the pressure without breaking a sweat. And then, I find out the very woman serving me my scotch is the sister of a degenerate gambler, bleeding out to one of my rogue collectors. The universe put you in my path for a reason. She pulled her hand back slowly, fighting the urge to bolt. What are you proposing? A transaction. A fair one, Damien replied. You owe $40,000. A waitress salary at the Blackwood Grill won't cover that before Jimmy, or someone worse, loses patience. I'm erasing your brother's debt. Her breath hitched. Just like that? Erased? In exchange for your employment, he clarified. I already have a job, Clara said flatly. You have a minimum wage cage, Damien countered dismissively. I host private high-stakes poker games, the kind of games attended by politicians, judges, and men who run this city. Alderman Thomas Gallagher, union boss Frank O'Keefe, men who require absolute discretion, flawless service, and an environment completely devoid of panic. I need someone to manage the floor during these games, someone who doesn't rattle, someone like you. You want me to work for the mob, she said flatly. I want you to work for me, he corrected, his gaze turning intense, almost possessive. 1 year, Clara. You manage the floor for my private games. You ensure the whiskey flows, the tempers remain cooled, and the guests are accommodated. You will be paid a salary that makes your tips here look like pocket change. And Leo's debt is zeroed out tonight. It was a deal with the devil. But as she looked at the ledger, she realized she was already in hell. Damien was just offering her a heavily armored boat to cross the river. 1 year, Clara said, her voice steadying. But I have conditions. Damien raised a dark eyebrow, genuinely amused. You are in $40,000 of debt to a crime syndicate, and you are issuing conditions. If I'm working for you, I need peace of mind, she stated, squaring her shoulders. Condition 1. Jimmy O'Donnell never comes near me or my family again. Condition 2. The debt is forgiven immediately, in writing. Condition 3. You pay for a 6-month inpatient rehab facility for Leo. If you just erase the debt, he'll rack up another one by Christmas. He needs to be locked away from a deck of cards. The silence that followed was deafening. Damien stared at her, his slate-grey eyes unreadable. She braced herself for the rejection, for the anger that she dared to overstep. Instead, Damien reached into his jacket, produced a platinum Mont Blanc pen, and signed his name at the bottom of the ledger. He slid it toward her. "Pack up your locker, Clara," Damien said softly, a dark smile playing on his lips. "You start on Friday, and wear black." Friday night arrived with a heavy, impending dread. She had quit the Blackwood Grill, leaving Richard speechless and stuttering. She stood in the mirrored elevator, ascending to the penthouse of the towering, Costello-owned building in the Gold Coast district. She was wearing a tailored, high-necked black dress that Damien had sent to her apartment via courier. It fit like a second skin, elegant but fiercely professional. When the elevator doors parted, she stepped into a world that made the Blackwood Grill look like a diner. The penthouse was a sprawling expanse of floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering Chicago skyline. The air was thick with the scent of Cuban cigars, expensive cologne, and the palpable tension of millions of dollars changing hands. Arthur was waiting for her at the entrance. The giant enforcer gave her a single, respectful nod, a stark departure from the suspicious glare he'd given her at the restaurant. "Miss Clara, the boss is expecting you." Clara was led into the main parlor. A massive, custom-built mahogany poker table sat in the center. Around it sat the power brokers of Chicago. She recognized Alderman Gallagher immediately, his face flushed as he nursed a tumbler of scotch. Next to him was a man she didn't know, a lean, sharp-featured man with eyes like a hawk, aggressively tossing chips into the center. And standing at the head of the room, observing his empire, was Damien. When he saw her, his eyes did a slow sweep from her heels to her face. The look wasn't entirely professional, but it was strictly guarded. He crossed the room, the other men subconsciously lowering their voices as he moved. "You look exactly the part," Damien murmured, stopping just inches from her. "Your job is simple. Keep the glasses full, keep the waitstaff invisible. And if you see anyone looking too closely at their neighbor's hands, you catch my eye. Understood?" "Understood." She nodded. The next 3 hours were a blur of high-wire hospitality. She commanded the small crew of servers, intercepting demands before they were spoken. She poured $1,000 cognac, lit $50 cigars, and acted as the smooth, calming presence in a room full of apex predators. It was going flawlessly. Until 1 a.m. She was walking down the dimly lit marble hallway toward the kitchen to fetch a fresh box of cohibas, when a heavy hand clamped down on her shoulder, spinning her around violently. Clara gasped, her back hitting the cool wall. Standing over her, reeking of cheap whiskey and desperation, was Jimmy the Pipe O'Donnell. His face was contorted in a bruised, furious snarl. He had a black eye, and his lip was split, evidence of Damien ending his tenure. "You think you're smart, huh, bitch?" Jimmy hissed, spit flying from his lips as he pinned her against the wall with a meaty forearm across her collarbone. "You went over my head. You cost me my territory. Costello stripped me of my collections because of you." "Let me go, Jimmy," Clara demanded, forcing her voice to remain low, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a scream. "I'm going to take that 40 grand out of your hide right now," he growled, reaching into his jacket. Her heart stopped. She braced for the impact, closing her eyes. "Take your hand off my property, Jimmy, or you lose it." The voice was quiet, but it cut through the hallway like a straight razor. Jimmy froze. Clara opened her eyes to see Damien standing at the end of the hall. He hadn't raised his voice. He didn't have a weapon drawn. He just stood there, his hands loosely clasped in front of him, radiating a lethality that made the air in the hallway turn to ice. Silas was standing 2 steps behind him, a suppressed pistol resting casually against his thigh. Jimmy swallowed hard, his face draining of color. He slowly stepped back, releasing her. "Mr. Costello, She owes me." "She owes you nothing. You were stealing from me, Jimmy," Damien said, taking a slow, measured step forward. "I told you to leave the city. I see you have a hearing problem." "Boss, please." Damien didn't even look at Silas. He simply gave a millimeter nod. Silas moved with terrifying speed. He crossed the distance, grabbed Jimmy by the scruff of his neck and his belt, and slammed him face first into the marble wall. Jimmy slumped to the floor, groaning, entirely incapacitated. "Take him to the basement," Damien ordered coldly. "Make sure he understands his new boundaries." Silas dragged Jimmy away, leaving her alone in the hallway with Damien. Her legs finally gave out. She slid down the wall, her chest heaving as the adrenaline crashed. Damien was beside her in an instant. He knelt on the marble floor, completely disregarding his tailored suit. He reached out, his thumb gently tracing the red mark Jimmy's forearm had left on her collarbone. His eyes were no longer cold. They were blazing with a dark, violent protectiveness. "Did he hurt you?" Damien asked, his voice a low, rough rasp. "No," Clara breathed, looking up into his eyes. "You got here in time." He leaned in closer, the scent of expensive bourbon and danger wrapping around her. "No one touches what is mine, Clara. Ever." The line between boss and savior, between captor and protector, vanished in that dimly lit hallway. As he gently helped her to her feet, his hand lingering on her waist, she realized the terrifying truth. She wasn't just working off a debt anymore. She was falling for the devil himself. The air in the penthouse parlor had grown thick, not just with the smoke of imported cigars, but with a creeping, invisible tension. It was 2:30 a.m. Following the incident with Jimmy in the hallway, her senses were dialed to an excruciating frequency. Every clink of ice against crystal, every shuffle of the heavy clay poker chips sounded like a warning bell. Clara returned to the floor, her black dress smoothed, her expression a meticulously crafted mask of professional detachment. Damien was seated at the head of the table, his posture relaxed, but his eyes tracked her return with a silent, heavy question. She gave him a nearly imperceptible nod. "I'm fine." The high-stakes game had dwindled to 3 active players: Damien, Alderman Thomas Gallagher, and a logistics magnate named Harrison Ford. No relation to the actor, just a ruthless businessman who controlled the shipping ports on Lake Michigan. The pot in the center of the mahogany table easily exceeded $400,000. "Your flush draw missed, Thomas," Damien observed smoothly, not even looking at his own cards. He took a slow sip of the Macallan 25 she had poured him. "You're sweating through your collar. You only do that when you're heavily leveraged on a bluff, or when you know something the rest of the room doesn't." Gallagher let out a nervous, barking laugh. He dabbed his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief. "Always the psychologist, Damien. I'm just running hot. The ventilation in here is terrible." It was a lie. The climate control in the penthouse was flawless. She was standing by the antique bar cart, slicing a lemon twist, when she noticed it. Gallagher kept checking his platinum Rolex. Not a casual glance to check the time, but a frantic, repetitive tick. Then his eyes darted toward the private elevator vestibule, the one strictly reserved for the Costello family, the one that completely bypassed the ground-floor security desk. Arthur was stationed by the main double doors, but the private vestibule was only guarded by a biometric lock, a lock that, she suddenly realized, Gallagher had been standing near 20 minutes ago, when he supposedly took a private phone call from his wife. A cold spike of adrenaline hit her bloodstream. She dropped the paring knife. "Arthur," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but in the hushed environment of the poker game, it cut through the room like a siren. Arthur looked at her, his hand instantly hovering over his jacket. Damien's eyes snapped away from Gallagher and locked onto hers. "The private vestibule," she said, pointing the silver tongs toward the frosted glass doors. "The indicator light is green. It's supposed to be red." Gallagher's face drained of all color. He pushed his chair back violently, abandoning a $100,000 hand. "I need to use the restroom." He didn't make it 2 steps. Silas stepped out from the shadows of the hallway, his massive frame blocking the alderman's path. Before anyone could speak, the frosted glass of the private vestibule shattered inward in a deafening explosion of noise and violence. The heavy doors were kicked open, and 4 men in tactical gear, faces obscured by black balaclavas, stormed into the parlor. They weren't street-level thugs like Jimmy. These were professionals, and they were carrying suppressed submachine guns. "Down!" Damien roared, overturning the massive mahogany poker table with a surge of brutal strength. The heavy table crashed to the floor, spilling hundreds of thousands of dollars in chips and cash, providing a thick, wooden barricade just as the first volley of suppressed gunfire chewed into the walls and the leather chairs. Harrison Ford screamed, diving behind the leather sofa. Clara hit the floor behind the solid oak bar cart, her hands covering her head as crystal decanters exploded above her, raining expensive scotch and shattered glass over her hair and shoulders. Arthur and Silas moved with terrifying, synchronized precision. They didn't panic. They drew their weapons and returned fire, their shots measured, disciplined, and lethally accurate. The parlor transformed into a war zone, the smell of cordite and spilled whiskey overpowering the expensive cigars. Through the chaos, she saw Gallagher crawling toward the hallway, trying to escape the crossfire he had clearly orchestrated. "Clara, stay down!" Damien's voice was a harsh command over the pop hiss of suppressed weapons. He was crouched behind the overturned table, returning fire with a matte black pistol he had drawn from an ankle holster. One of the masked men flanked the table, raising his weapon toward Damien's blind spot. Arthur was pinned down by suppressing fire from the doorway, and Silas was reloading. Clara didn't think. Instinct, raw and desperate, took over. She grabbed the heavy cast-iron ice bucket from the bottom shelf of the bar cart. She scrambled on her hands and knees, ignoring the glass slicing into her palms, and hurled the iron bucket with every ounce of strength she had. It struck the flanking gunman square in the side of the knee. The heavy metal shattered the joint with a sickening crunch. The man howled, his shot going wide and burying itself into the ceiling plaster as his leg buckled. Damien didn't hesitate. He pivoted and put 2 rounds into the man's chest, neutralizing the threat. Within 90 seconds, the firefight was over. The sudden silence in the room was heavier and more terrifying than the gunfire. 4 bodies laid on the Persian rug. Arthur was bleeding from a graze on his shoulder, but he was already moving, securing the perimeter. Silas had Alderman Gallagher pinned by the throat against the wall, the politician weeping and begging incoherently. Clara remained behind the bar cart, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Her hands were covered in blood from the broken glass. Footsteps approached her. Slow, deliberate. Damien knelt beside the cart. His charcoal suit was dusted with plaster, and a thin cut on his cheek was bleeding sluggishly, but his slate-grey eyes were entirely focused. He reached out, his large hands gently wrapping around her bleeding, shaking wrists. "You didn't stay down," he whispered, his voice rough, laced with a mixture of anger and profound awe. "He had a clear shot at you," she managed to say, her teeth chattering from the post-adrenaline shock. Damien looked from her bleeding hands to the neutralized gunman, then back to her face. The cold, calculating Mafia boss was gone. In his place was a man looking at her, as if she were the only thing keeping his world spinning. "Gallagher sold the access codes to the Sullivan Syndicate," Damien stated quietly, his thumb wiping a streak of blood from her palm. "They came to execute me and take the territory. If you hadn't noticed that lock, if you hadn't thrown that iron—" He stopped, his jaw clenching. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Damien Costello pulled her forward, lifting her from the broken glass, and pressed her against his chest. His heartbeat was a steady, powerful drum against her ear. "You saved my life, Clara," he murmured into her hair, his arms locking around her like a steel vault. "And in my world, a debt of blood is absolute. The reality of a mob shootout is not the glamorous, slow-motion ballet depicted in Hollywood cinema. It is deafening, chaotic, and leaves behind a smell that permanently etches itself into your olfactory memory, a sickening blend of cordite, vaporized drywall, copper, and the sharp tang of spilled, centuries-old scotch." Within 45 minutes, the penthouse had been transformed from a war zone into a sterile crime scene, and then simply into an empty room. A specialized trauma cleanup crew operating under the innocuous LLCA Clearwater Solutions had arrived through the private freight elevator. They worked in absolute, terrifying silence. Bodies were zipped into heavy, unmarked polyethylene bags. The blood-soaked Persian rug was rolled up, and enzymatic solvents were applied to the hardwood beneath it to destroy any trace of biological evidence. There were no police sirens wailing in the Chicago night. There was no panic. Just the cold, bureaucratic efficiency of a shadow government erasing its mistakes. Clara sat on a pristine leather Chesterfield in Damien's private study, miles away from the chaos of the parlor, though the ringing in her ears hadn't stopped. Dr. Samuel Hastings, a brilliant former trauma surgeon whose gambling addiction had cost him his medical license and bought him a permanent position on the Costello payroll, was meticulously working on her hands. "You have deep defensive lacerations, Clara," Hastings murmured, his voice a gravelly whisper, as he applied a stinging, iodine-based antiseptic. "You're incredibly lucky. No severed tendons, no nerve damage. But I have to put in about 30 stitches. You won't be carrying heavy trays or opening tight jars for a very long time." She didn't flinch as the curved needle pierced her skin. The local anesthetic had rendered her hands numb, but her mind was a terrifyingly lucid engine, processing the sheer magnitude of what had just occurred. She had thrown an iron bucket at a trained assassin. She had saved the life of the most dangerous man in the Midwest. Across the dimly lit study, Damien stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, overlooking the glittering grid of the loop. His ruined charcoal suit jacket was discarded on a chair. He wore a simple black button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled up past his elbows, revealing intricate dark ink that sprawled across his forearms, symbols of loyalty, violence, and oaths taken in blood. He was speaking into an encrypted burner phone in rapid, hushed Italian. The tension radiating from his broad shoulders was palpable enough to crack glass. Hastings finished wrapping her hands in thick, white gauze. He packed his black leather medical bag, offered Damien a silent, respectful nod, and slipped out of the heavy oak door. They were alone. Damien ended his call, snapped the burner phone in half, and tossed the pieces into the fireplace. He walked over to the mahogany sidebar, poured 2 glasses of the surviving Pappy Van Winkle bourbon, and crossed the room to where she sat. He didn't sit next to her immediately. He took the armchair opposite the Chesterfield, giving her physical space, though his slate-grey eyes never left her face. He set 1 glass on the table in front of her. "Leo is safe," Damien stated. His voice was no longer the roaring command from the shootout. It was a low, steady anchor in the storm. At 3:15 a.m., he was admitted to the Promise Clinic in Wisconsin under an assumed name. It is an exclusive, high-security psychiatric and addiction recovery facility. The perimeter is guarded by my private security contractors. Jimmy O'Donnell and his associates do not know he is there, and even if they did, they couldn't get within a mile of the gates. Clara let out a shuddering breath, closing her eyes as a crushing weight lifted off her chest. The debt. Damien reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded ledger paper, the very same one he had shown her at the Blackwood Grill. He struck a platinum Zippo lighter, held the flame to the corner of the paper, and dropped it into the heavy crystal ashtray on the table. They both watched the $40,000 death sentence curl into black ash. "The debt is erased," Damien said, "and Gallagher is currently providing Silas with every security code, bank routing number, and operational secret the Sullivan Syndicate possesses. By sunrise, Alderman Thomas Gallagher will officially be reported as a tragic casualty of a late-night boating accident on Lake Michigan." Clara swallowed hard. The casual confirmation of murder should have sent her running for the door. 6 weeks ago, it would have. But the Clara who worked the graveyard shift was gone, burned away in the crucible of tonight's crossfire. "They tried to kill you," she said, her voice remarkably steady. "And they failed," Damien replied, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Because of you. You saw the compromised lock. You threw the iron. You stepped between a bullet and its target. In my world, Clara, a blood debt is the highest currency that exists. It overrides contracts, it overrides money, and it overrides my own selfish desires." He paused, a muscle ticking violently in his strong jaw. He looked down at his own hands, calloused and stained with the night's violence, before looking back up at her. "I am giving you an out," Damien said, the words clearly costing him agonizing effort. "I have instructed the law firm of Sterling and Hayes to open an offshore trust in the Cayman Islands under your name. There is $5 million in that account. By noon tomorrow, Arthur will hand you a portfolio containing a new passport, a new social security number, and a first-class ticket to any city in Europe you choose. You will have a clean life, a safe life. You will never have to look over your shoulder, and you will never have to see the violence that follows me." Clara stared at him. $5 million. Total freedom. It was the absolute fantasy she had prayed for every night while counting crumpled dollar bills in a humid apartment. It was the ultimate prize. "Why are you pushing me away?" she asked softly. "Because tomorrow I am going to war," Damien answered, his eyes darkening with a terrifying, primal coldness. "Patrick Sullivan authorized a hit on my life in my own home. I am not going to arrest him. I am going to dismantle his life. I am going to burn his legitimate shipping fronts to the ground. I am going to systematically eliminate his lieutenants. The things I am going to do over the next 72 hours are monstrous, Clara. I am a monster. And you are a woman who used to shake when you carried a tray of drinks." "I didn't shake tonight," she countered, sitting up straighter, ignoring the throbbing pain in her bandaged hands. "No, you didn't," he admitted, his gaze dropping to her lips for a fraction of a second before snapping back to her eyes. "But you don't belong in the dark. You stepped into it to save your brother. You accomplished your mission. Take the money, Clara. Take the flight. Because if you stay—" He trailed off, his breathing becoming slightly heavier. "If I stay what?" Clara challenged, the adrenaline creeping back into her veins, entirely different this time. It wasn't fear. It was power. Damien stood up abruptly. He paced to the window, staring out at the city he ruled, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "If you stay, the door locks behind you. You become my greatest asset, and therefore my greatest vulnerability. If you stay, you aren't just an employee anymore. You are mine. You become the queen on a very bloody chessboard. You will have more power than the mayor of this city, but you will never sleep with both eyes closed again." "And I—" He turned to face her, the mask of the stoic Mafia boss completely fracturing. "I will never, ever let you go." The silence in the study was absolute. Clara looked at the crystal ashtray containing the ashes of her old life. She thought about the $5 million and the lonely, quiet life in Europe. And then she looked at Damien Costello, a man who had shielded her from a brute in a hallway, who had ensured her brother's safety above his own, and who was currently offering her the world on a silver platter, terrified that his own darkness would consume her. She didn't want the safe, quiet life. She realized with a sudden, breathtaking clarity that she had been bored and dying inside long before Jimmy O'Donnell ever threatened her. She craved the fire. She stood up from the Chesterfield. Her legs were steady. She walked across the Persian rug, closing the distance between them until she was mere inches from him. She had to tilt her head back to look into his eyes. "I told you on my first night at Table 9 that I don't startle easily," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know exactly who you are, Damien. I saw the monster tonight, and the monster was the one who pulled me out of the glass and made sure I was breathing." Damien's chest heaved. He slowly reached up, his large, warm hands hovering over her bandaged ones, afraid to hurt her, before tracing the line of her jaw. "Clara," he breathed, a warning and a prayer wrapped into one word. "Keep your $5 million, she whispered, stepping into his space, letting her chest press against his. "And tell Arthur to shred the passport. I'm not going to Europe." With a ragged, desperate groan, Damien's restraint shattered. His hands tangled in her hair, and his mouth crashed down on hers. It was a kiss born of gunpowder, adrenaline, and absolute claiming. It was rough and hungry, a physical manifestation of the violent world they had just survived. She kissed him back with equal ferocity, her bandaged hands gripping the front of his shirt, anchoring herself to the center of his storm. The waitress who lived in fear was dead. She died behind the bar cart in a hail of suppressed gunfire. In her place stood Clara Costello, the woman who walked up to the graveyard, looked the devil in the eye, and decided she wanted to rule hell beside him. The reality of stepping into the criminal underworld isn't painted in the romantic, golden hues of Hollywood cinema. It is a life measured in high-security perimeters, encrypted phone lines, and the constant, thrumming weight of looking over your shoulder. Marrying into the Costello syndicate fundamentally rewrote the architecture of Clara's existence. She traded the crippling anxiety of minimum-wage survival for the terrifying, high-stakes architecture of managing an empire's legitimate fronts while Damien handled the shadows. Yet, the twisting irony of real life is that sometimes the safest harbor is found in the eye of the deadliest storm. She was no longer Clara Jenkins, the desperate waitress trembling before Table 9. She was Clara Costello, a woman who looked the devil in the eye, demanded a fair deal, and built an unbreakable throne out of the ashes of a shattered life.